They called her the trophy wife, the silent shadow in the corner of the gala. For 10 years, Cecilia Montgomery wore the diamonds, poured the wine, and looked the other way, while her husband, Arthur, built an empire on lies and paraded his mistress through the streets of Manhattan. When he finally handed her the divorce papers, he laughed, telling his high-priced lawyers she was powerless and nobody. He thought he was discarding a broken woman. He didn't know he was declaring war on the most dangerous family in New York. You think you know how a divorce trial ends? You have no idea. This is the story of how the silent wife didn't just win, she burned his world to the ground. The divorce papers hit the mahogany coffee table with a slap that echoed through the penthouse at 432 Park Avenue. It was a cold Tuesday in November, the kind where the wind coming off the Hudson River felt like a physical assault. Inside, however, the air was perfectly conditioned, scented with Arthur's expensive sandalwood cologne and the lingering metallic tang of betrayal. Arthur Montgomery stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city he believed he owned. He was 45, handsome in a jagged, predatory way, wearing a bespoke suit from Anderson & Shepherd that cost more than most people's cars. He didn't even turn around to look at his wife, Cecilia. "It's a generous offer, Cece," Arthur said, his voice smooth, devoid of any real emotion. He took a sip of his scotch. "You get the condo in Jersey, the 2018 Rover, and a monthly stipend for 3 years. It's more than a girl from... where was it again? Nowhere, Ohio, could ever dream of." Cecilia sat on the edge of the cream-colored sofa, her hands folded neatly in her lap. To the outside world, she was the quintessential trophy wife. 34, impeccably dressed in neutrals, quiet, submissive. She had spent the last decade raising their twin boys, Leo and Sam, and managing Arthur's social calendar. She had hosted his dinners, charmed his investors, and ignored the lipstick stains on his collars. "I don't want the condo in Jersey, Arthur," Cecilia said softly. Her voice was steady, but Arthur mistook her calm for shock. He finally turned, a smirk playing on his lips. "It's not really a negotiation, sweetie. You signed the prenup, you remember? That flimsy little piece of paper you were too in love to read properly 10 years ago? Benedict says it's ironclad." Benedict. Benedict Sterling. The name made Cecilia's stomach tighten. Benedict Sterling was the managing partner at Sterling, Locke and Vane, the most vicious divorce firm in the city. They were known as the Butchers of Wall Street. If Arthur had hired Benedict, he wasn't just planning to leave her. He was planning to destroy her. "I remember the prenup," Cecilia said, her eyes lifting to meet his. They were grey, usually warm, but today they looked like slate. "But Arthur, you're leaving me for her, aren't you? Jessica." Arthur didn't even flinch. "Jessica understands my ambition. She's a VP at Goldman. She's on my level. Look, Cece, we had a good run. You gave me 2 great kids, but let's be real. You're a housewife. You have no degree that matters, no connections, and no money of your own. Don't make this ugly. If you fight me, Benedict will bury you under so much legal paperwork, you'll be bankrupt before the first hearing." He walked over, picked up the papers and tossed them closer to her. "Sign them by Friday, or I cut off the credit cards." He walked out of the apartment without looking back, slamming the heavy oak door. Cecilia sat in the silence of the multi-million-dollar prison for a long time. She looked at the papers. She looked at the photos of Leo and Sam on the mantel. Then she reached into her purse, a modest tote bag, not the Birkin Arthur had bought her for appearances, and pulled out a burner phone. She dialed a number she hadn't called in 12 years. The area code was from Boston, 617, It rang twice. Harrington residence, a stiff, elderly voice answered. Edgar speaking. Edgar, Cecilia said, her voice finally breaking. Just a fracture. It's me. It's Catherine. There was a profound silence on the other end. Miss Catherine, my God, it has been... Does your father know you are calling? No, she whispered. But tell him. Tell him I'm ready to come home. And tell him to bring the jagged edge. I'm going to need the firm. Cecilia hung up. She walked to the window where Arthur had stood moments before. She wasn't Cecilia Montgomery, the nobody from Ohio. That was a lie she had constructed to escape a life of suffocating pressure. She was Catherine Harrington, the sole heiress to the Harrington legal dynasty, the oldest, most ruthless family of litigators on the East Coast, a family that ate men like Benedict Sterling for breakfast. Arthur thought she was powerless. He was about to find out that he had been sleeping next to a nuclear warhead. The conference room at Sterling Lock and Vane was designed to intimidate. It was all glass and chrome, situated on the 50th floor, looking down on the ants of the city. Cecilia sat on one side of the massive granite table. She was alone. She had told Arthur she would represent herself for the preliminary deposition, a move that had caused Arthur to laugh so hard he'd choked on his espresso. Across from her sat the Tribunal of Doom. Arthur was there, looking bored, scrolling on his phone. Next to him was Jessica Vane. Yes, the mistress was actually present. It was a psychological power play. Jessica was striking, sharp-featured, wearing a red power suit that screamed aggression. And in the center sat Benedict Sterling. Benedict was a large man, balding, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of ham. He didn't just speak, he bellowed. Mrs. Montgomery, Benedict began, not even bothering to look up from his files. I must advise you, representing yourself is a fool's errand. But if you insist on saving the legal fees, that's your funeral. I'm comfortable, Cecilia said quietly. She wore a simple navy dress, no jewelry. She looked small. Right, Benedict sneered. He turned on the recorder. State your name for the record. Cecilia Montgomery. And your occupation? Mother. Homemaker. Jessica snorted from the side. Unemployed, she muttered, loud enough for the microphone to catch. Arthur smirked. Benedict continued, relentless. Mrs. Montgomery, we are establishing the basis for the spousal support cap. You claim to have contributed to the household, yet tax records show you have earned $0 in the last 10 years. You have no assets. Your family in Ohio operates a failing hardware store. Is that correct? That is what the records say, Cecilia replied. So, you bring nothing to the table. Benedict leaned in, his teeth bared. Arthur built this fortune. Arthur bought the house. Arthur paid for the clothes on your back. And now you want half? You want custody? Let me tell you what's going to happen. We are going to prove you are unfit. Cecilia's head snapped up. Unfit? We have witnesses, Jessica chimed in, her voice dripping with venom. Waiters, drivers, nannies, people who will testify that you drink during the day, that you're unstable, depressed. That's a lie, Cecilia said, her voice trembling slightly. It's not a lie if we win. Benedict smiled, a cold, shark-like expression. Here is the new deal, Cecilia. You walk away with nothing. No alimony. You get supervised visitation with the boys every other weekend. And you sign a non-disclosure agreement stating you will never speak of the Montgomery business practices. If you refuse, we release the evidence of your instability. We will ruin you. Arthur finally looked at her, his eyes cold. Just take it, Cece. You can't fight us. You're a nobody. You're a little mouse in a room full of cats." Cecilia looked down at her hands. She counted to 3. The trembling stopped. "Are you finished?" she asked. Benedict laughed. "Oh, we're just getting started, sweetheart." "Good," Cecilia said. She reached into her bag. "Because I didn't come alone." The heavy double doors of the conference room swung open with a resounding boom. The room went silent. Walking through the doors was not a lawyer. It was a phalanx. Leading the pack was a man in his late 60s, leaning on a cane with a silver wolf's head handle. He wore a 3-piece charcoal suit that looked older than the building, but cost more than the floor they were standing on. His eyes were the same slate grey as Cecilia's, but hard as diamonds. Behind him were 4 associates in identical black suits, carrying briefcases like weapons. Benedict Sterling froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He recognized the man. Every lawyer in the tri-state area recognized the man. It was Judge Archibald Harrington, the retired Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court and the patriarch of the Harrington firm. "Who the hell is this?" Arthur demanded, standing up. "This is a private deposition." Archibald Harrington ignored Arthur completely. He walked, slowly, painfully, but with terrifying authority, over to Cecilia. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "I apologize for my lateness, Catherine," Archibald said, his voice deep and gravelly, echoing off the glass walls. "Traffic in the tunnel was dreadful." "Catherine." Arthur looked confused. "Her name is Cecilia." Archibald slowly turned his head to look at Arthur. It was the look a lion gives a gazelle before tearing its throat out. "To you, she is Cecilia Montgomery, the housewife you thought you could bully," Archibald said. "To the State Bar of New York, and to me, she is Catherine Cecilia Harrington, my daughter, and the finest legal mind my family has produced in 3 generations." Archibald turned his gaze to Benedict Sterling, who was now sweating profusely. "Hello, Benedict." Archibald smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I believe you used to clerk for me back in '98. I fired you for incompetence, didn't I?" Benedict swallowed hard, loosening his tie. "Judge Harrington, I didn't know." "Clearly." Archibald pulled out a chair and sat down at the head of the table, displacing Benedict's lead associate. "Now, about this unfit mother narrative you're spinning, I suggest you retract it, because my associates here have just filed a countersuit." One of the associates slammed a thick stack of documents onto the table. Thud. "We aren't suing for half," Archibald said calmly. "We are suing for everything. RICO charges, Arthur. Fraud, embezzlement. And for you, Miss Vane." He looked at the mistress who had gone pale. "Alienation of affection is rarely prosecuted these days, but I'm feeling nostalgic." Cecilia looked up at her husband, whose arrogance had evaporated into sheer panic. She smiled, and for the first time, Arthur saw the predator hiding beneath the skin of his wife. "I think," Cecilia said, her voice clear and strong, "we should renegotiate." The drive from the city to the Harrington estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, was silent. Cecilia, or Catherine, as she was reclaiming her name, sat in the back of the vintage Rolls-Royce Phantom next to her father. For 10 years, she had driven a practical SUV. She had clipped coupons. She had worried about the price of organic milk. Sitting here now, surrounded by hand-stitched leather and the scent of old money, felt like waking up from a long, feverish dream. "You look tired, Cat," Archibald said, breaking the silence. He didn't look at her. He was watching the autumn leaves blur past the window. "I'm not tired, Daddy," she replied, staring at her hands. "I'm angry. I spent a decade trying to be what he wanted. Small, quiet, supportive. I thought if I made myself smaller, there would be more room for him to love me. Archibald grunted. Men like Arthur Montgomery don't want room. They want a mirror. They want someone to reflect their own ego back at them twice the size. When you didn't do that, he went looking for a shinier mirror. That Miss Vane woman. He thinks I'm stupid, Cecilia said, a dark amusement coloring her voice. That's the part that hurts the most, not the cheating. I suspected the cheating for years. It's that he thinks I'm incapable of understanding his world. Archibald tapped his cane on the floorboard. Then let's show him just how much you understand. We have work to do. When they arrived at the estate, the library was already converted into a war room. It was a massive space, lined with first editions and smelling of cedar and tobacco. But now, the antique oak tables were covered in servers, laptops, and boxes of files. 3 young associates were typing furiously. One of them, a sharp-eyed woman named Julianne, looked up. "We've accessed the preliminary discovery files Arthur's team sent over," Julianne said. "It's a joke. They redacted 80% of the financial statements. They're claiming his net worth is around $4 million. Cecilia walked over to the table. She picked up a balance sheet from Montgomery Holdings. She scanned it for less than 10 seconds. "He's hiding the assets in the Cayman shell companies," Cecilia said, pointing to a line item labeled Consulting Fees, A&J Partners. "Look at the recurring payments, $50,000 a month to A&J. That stands for Arthur and Jessica. It's not a consulting firm, it's a piggy bank." Julianne looked at Cecilia, stunned. "How did you... that looks like a standard vendor payment." Cecilia pulled a chair out and sat down. The transformation was complete. The slumped shoulders of the housewife were gone. In her place was the woman who had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law, a fact she had buried to play the role of the doting wife. "Arthur has a tell when he's lying with numbers," Cecilia explained, grabbing a red pen. "He likes round numbers. Real business expenses are messy. They're 4,821 mort, då senas 18 Arthur's fake expenses are always clean. 50,000, 12,000, 5,000. She began circling items on the spreadsheet rapidly. The red ink looked like blood on the paper. "Here," she said, "the expansion into the Seaport district. He claimed it lost money. It didn't. He funneled the profits into a blind trust in his mother's name. I saw the mail from the trust arrive at the house 3 years ago. He told me it was junk mail. I memorized the return address." Archibald stood in the corner, pouring 2 glasses of scotch. He watched his daughter work with a swell of pride that he hadn't felt since she passed the bar exam 15 years ago, before she ran away to play house with a narcissist. "He never knew, did he?" Archibald asked, handing her a glass. "That you were the editor of the Law Review?" "He never asked." Cecilia took a sip. "He met me when I was volunteering at a shelter, trying to get away from the family name. He assumed I was a sweet, simple girl with a big heart and a small brain. I just never corrected him. I wanted to be loved for me, not for the Harrington influence." "And now?" "Now," Cecilia said, slamming the file shut. "I'm going to use the influence to crush him." Meanwhile, back in Manhattan, panic was setting in. Arthur Montgomery paced the floor of his office. "Who is Archibald Harrington? Someone tell me why my lawyer looked like he was going to wet himself." Jessica Vane was sitting on his desk, smoking a cigarette, her hand shaking slightly. "Arthur, you idiot. The Harringtons aren't just lawyers. They're the lawyers. They represent senators, oil tycoons, royalty. If his daughter is your wife, why did she act like a peasant for 10 years? "I don't know," Arthur screamed, throwing a crystal paperweight against the wall. It shattered. "She said her dad ran a hardware store." "Technically," came a voice from the doorway. It was Benedict Sterling. He looked dishevelled, his tie crooked. Harrington Industrial Supply is a hardware store. It just happens to be a global conglomerate that supplies parts for aerospace engineering. They also own half the commercial real estate in Boston. Benedict walked in and poured himself a drink without asking. "We have a problem, Arthur. A big one. I just got a call from the clerk at the courthouse. The judge assigned to our case just recused himself." "Why?" Arthur demanded. "Because he used to play golf with Archibald Harrington, and he said he values his career too much to get in the middle of a Harrington blood feud. We've been reassigned to Judge Patterson." Jessica's face went white. "Patterson? She's the toughest judge on financial fraud in the state. She hates men who hide assets." "Exactly." Benedict downed his drink. "And 5 minutes ago, we received a digital subpoena. They aren't just asking for bank records, Arthur. They have the IP addresses of your offshore accounts. They have the routing numbers. They know about A&J Partners." Arthur froze. "How? How could they possibly know that?" Benedict looked at him with pity. "Because you lived with a spy for 10 years. You didn't marry a trophy wife, Arthur. You married a sleeper agent." Arthur sank into his chair. For the first time, the reality of the situation hit him. This wasn't going to be a divorce. It was going to be an execution. The weeks leading up to Christmas in New York are a gauntlet of social obligations. The crowning jewel of the season was always the Winter Solstice Gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was the night where the elite cemented their status. Arthur had been debating whether to go. The rumors were already swirling. The unfit mother narrative had died a quiet death the moment Archibald Harrington walked into the room, replaced by hushed whispers about Arthur's impending doom. "We have to go," Jessica insisted, zipping up a dress that cost more than the average American's annual salary. It was gold, loud, and aggressive. "If we hide, we look guilty. We need to show them we're still the power couple. We need to secure the investors for the Q1 launch." Arthur adjusted his bow tie. He looked thinner. The stress was eating him alive. "Fine. But we stay for an hour. Make the rounds. Leave." They arrived at the Met in a flurry of camera flashes. Arthur put on his best smile, the one that had charmed millions out of investors' pockets. He held Jessica's waist, guiding her up the iconic steps. Inside, the great hall was transformed into a winter wonderland. But as Arthur and Jessica entered, the temperature seemed to drop. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. But they weren't looking at Arthur. They were looking past him. Arthur turned around. Standing at the top of the staircase, framed by the massive floral archway, was Cecilia. She was unrecognizable. Gone were the beige cardigans and the sensible flats. She was wearing a custom gown of midnight blue velvet that hugged her frame like a second skin, off the shoulder, trailing into a dramatic train. Around her neck sat the Harrington sapphires, a necklace of diamonds and deep blue stones that hadn't been seen in public since her mother died 20 years ago. She didn't look down. She looked straight ahead, her chin high, radiating a cold, regal power. Archibald stood beside her in a tuxedo, looking like a king protecting his heir. "My God," someone whispered nearby. "Is that the wife? The quiet one?" Cecilia began to descend the stairs. She didn't walk. She glided. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. Arthur felt his feet rooted to the floor. He wanted to run, but he couldn't look away. She was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and she was looking at him with absolute indifference. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she didn't avoid him. She walked straight toward him. Jessica, sensing the threat, stepped forward, linking her arm tightly through Arthur's. "Well, if it isn't the little housewife playing dress-up," Jessica hissed, though her voice wavered. "Did Daddy rent the jewels for you?" The circle of onlookers tightened. Everyone wanted to see the bloodbath. Cecilia stopped. She looked at Jessica, not with anger, but with the mild curiosity one might show a bug on a windshield. "Hello, Jessica," Cecilia said. Her voice was low, melodic, and carried perfectly in the silenced hall. "That dress is brave. Gold really highlights desperation." Someone in the crowd coughed to hide a laugh. "And Arthur," Cecilia turned her gaze to her husband. "I brought you something. Since you've been dodging the process servers at the office." She held out a manicured hand. A waiter, who had been standing by as if on cue, placed a silver tray between them. On the tray was not champagne, but a single, thick, white envelope, sealed with the red wax crest of the Harrington firm. "What is this?" Arthur hissed, his face flushing red. "Do not do this here." "It's a notification, Arthur," Cecilia said, loud enough for the board members of his company standing nearby to hear. "We've frozen the assets of A&J Partners, and we've filed a motion to attach your equity in Montgomery Holdings to the settlement. Effective immediately, you can't sell, trade, or move a single dime without my permission." She leaned in closer, her perfume, something expensive and spicy, filling his senses. "You said I was powerless," she whispered, her eyes locking onto his. "You said I brought nothing to the table. So I'm taking the table away, and the house, and the company." Arthur stared at the envelope. He could feel the eyes of his investors burning into him. He saw Mr. Henderson, his biggest backer, turn his back and walk away. Jessica tried to salvage the moment. "You can't do that. This is harassment." Cecilia laughed, a light, airy sound. "Oh, Jessica, I'm not harassing you. I'm evicting you. The apartment you're currently staying in, the one Arthur bought last month for your trysts. He bought it through a shell company owned by Harrington Industrial. My father owns the building. You have 24 hours to vacate. I'd suggest packing tonight." Cecilia didn't wait for a response. She turned to the crowd, her face brightening into a warm, social smile. "Now, has anyone tried the crab cakes? I hear they're divine." She swept past them, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Arthur and Jessica standing alone in the center of the room, holding a subpoena on a silver platter, while the elite of New York whispered behind their hands. Arthur looked at Jessica. "You said you checked the deed on the apartment." I trusted you," Jessica shrieked. "Keep your voice down," Arthur snapped. But it was too late. The illusion of their power was shattered. From the balcony above, Archibald Harrington watched the scene unfold. He took a sip of his champagne and dialed a number on his cell phone. "It's done," he said into the phone. "Release the press statement to the Wall Street Journal. Title it, 'Montgomery Holdings Under Investigation for Massive Embezzlement.' Run it for the morning edition." He hung up and watched his daughter holding court below. The war had just moved from the private sector to the public square, and Arthur Montgomery was already a casualty. But the worst part for Arthur, he didn't even know about the criminal charges yet. The morning after the Winter Solstice Gala, the sun rose over a Manhattan that looked exactly the same. But for Arthur Montgomery, the world had fundamentally shifted axis. It started at 6:00 a.m. His phone didn't ring. It vibrated incessantly, a continuous buzz against the nightstand of the hotel room he was forced to stay in after Cecilia's security team barred him from the penthouse. He rolled over, his head throbbing from too much scotch and too little sleep. He picked up the phone. 42 missed calls, 20 from his CFO, 10 from the board of directors, 12 from Benedict Sterling. Arthur opened his news app. The headline was impossible to miss. It was the lead story on the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and Bloomberg. The Montgomery Mirage, how New York's golden boy built an empire on smoke and embezzlement. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. He sat up, scrolling frantically. The article was detailed, terrifyingly so. It didn't just speculate, it had receipts. It listed the shell companies in the Caymans. It detailed the tax evasion schemes. It even had a quote from an anonymous source close to the investigation, confirming that the SEC was opening a formal inquiry. "Jessica!" Arthur shouted, kicking the duvet off. "Jessica, wake up!" Jessica Vane groaned from the other side of the bed. She looked wrecked. The humiliation at the gala had stripped away her veneer of arrogance. "What is it?" she snapped. "They leaked it." Arthur paced the small hotel room, running a hand through his hair. "The Harringtons. They leaked the financial records to the press. Stock is down 40% in pre-market trading. The board is calling an emergency meeting at 9 a.m. to vote on my removal as CEO. Jessica sat up, her eyes widening. But she didn't look worried for Arthur. She looked worried for herself. She grabbed her own phone. "Arthur," she said slowly, her voice trembling. "My name is in the article." "What?" "Right here. Paragraph 4. Funds were allegedly funneled through A&J Partners, a consulting firm registered to Jessica Vane, VP at Goldman Sachs." She looked up at him, horror dawning. "I'm a VP at a major bank. If they link me to embezzlement, I'm not just fired. I'm going to federal prison." Arthur stopped pacing. He looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a partner. He saw a liability. "You signed the papers for A&J, Jessica," he said coldly. "I told you it was just for tax efficiency. If you didn't read what you were signing, that's not my problem." The silence in the room was deafening. Jessica stood up slowly. She was wearing one of Arthur's shirts. "I signed them because you told me you loved me. You told me we were building a future. Now you're saying I'm the fall guy." "I'm saying I have a legal team to pay for," Arthur snapped, putting on his pants. "And right now, I need to save my company. You need to figure out your own situation. Call a lawyer." He grabbed his jacket and stormed out of the hotel room, leaving her alone. Arthur thought he was being pragmatic. He didn't realize he had just made a fatal error. He had backed a cornered animal into a wall. And Jessica Vane, despite her moral failings, was a survivor. 2 hours later, in a quiet, dimly lit tea room in the back of the St. Regis Hotel, Cecilia sat waiting. She was drinking Earl Grey, her posture perfect. The chair opposite her was pulled out. Jessica Vane sat down. She wore dark sunglasses and a trench coat, looking like a woman on the run. "You look terrible," Cecilia said gently. There was no mockery in her voice, which somehow made it worse. Jessica took off the sunglasses. Her eyes were red and swollen. "You ruined my life, Cecilia. Are you happy?" "I didn't ruin your life," Cecilia replied, pouring a second cup of tea. "Arthur did. I just turned on the lights. You were the one standing in the dark with him." Jessica stared at the tea. "Goldman fired me via email an hour ago. Compliance is freezing my accounts. I have nothing. Arthur left me at the hotel. He said it was my problem." Cecilia nodded. "That sounds like Arthur. He loves people only as long as they are useful. I was useful for his image. You were useful for his ego. Now that we're both liabilities, we're discarded." Cecilia reached into her purse and pulled out a thin file folder. She slid it across the table. "What is this?" Jessica asked. "Immunity," Cecilia said. "Or as close as you're going to get. My father has friends at the district attorney's office. If you agree to testify that Arthur misled you, that you signed those papers under duress and manipulation, and that he was the sole beneficiary of the funds, we can push for a plea deal, probation. No jail time." Jessica looked at the folder, then at Cecilia. "Why would you help me? I slept with your husband. I mocked you to your face." Cecilia took a sip of her tea. Her grey eyes were steel. "Because, Jessica, I don't care about you. You're just a symptom of the disease. I want the disease itself. I want Arthur. And to bury him completely, I need his accomplice to turn witness." Jessica hesitated for only a second. She remembered Arthur's cold eyes in the hotel room. "That's not my problem." She picked up the pen Cecilia had placed on the table. "Where do I sign?" The divorce trial of Montgomery versus Montgomery was dubbed the trial of the decade by the New York Post. The courtroom at the Supreme Court of New York was packed to capacity. Reporters, socialites, and curious onlookers squeezed into the wooden benches. Arthur sat at the defendant's table. He looked haggard. The last week had been a blur of subpoenas and shouting matches. He had been ousted as CEO of his own company. His assets were frozen. His friends had stopped returning his calls. But he still had Benedict Sterling. Benedict leaned over to Arthur. "Look, it's bad, but it's not over. We can still fight the custody. If we prove she's vindictive, that she's using the legal system to harass you, we might get sympathy from Judge Patterson. We just need to stay on message. You are a loving father, and she is a scorned woman out for blood." "Rise," the bailiff shouted. Judge Patterson entered. She was a stern woman with glasses on a chain and a reputation for zero tolerance for theatrics. "Be seated," she commanded. "We are here for final arguments regarding the division of assets and custody arrangements. Mr. Sterling, you may proceed." Benedict stood up, buttoning his jacket. He put on his best performance. He painted Arthur as a hard-working visionary who had fallen out of love, and Cecilia as a deceptive woman who had hidden her identity and was now using her family's wealth to bully a self-made man. "Your Honor," Benedict boomed. "Mrs. Montgomery, or Ms. Harrington, as she now prefers, deceived my client for 10 years. She pretended to be destitute. Now she uses her father's influence to destroy his business. This is not justice, it is a vendetta. We ask that the prenup be upheld and that Mr. Montgomery be granted full custody of the children, as he can provide a stable environment free from this billionaire warfare." Arthur nodded solemnly. It was a good speech. Then it was Archibald Harrington's turn. The old lion didn't stand up immediately. He let the silence stretch. Then he slowly rose, leaning heavily on his cane. "Your Honor," Archibald said, his voice quiet, forcing everyone to lean in. "Mr. Sterling speaks of deception. Let us talk about deception." He turned to look at Arthur. "We are not here to argue about money. Mr. Montgomery has no money left. The forensic audit completed this morning shows he is technically insolvent." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Arthur's eyes widened. "We are here," Archibald continued, "to discuss character. Specifically, the character of a man who would gaslight his wife, defraud his investors and—" He paused. "Endanger his children." "Objection!" Benedict shouted. "There is no evidence of child endangerment." "Is there not?" Archibald smiled. "I would like to call a surprise witness, a witness who has been on the chaotic inside of Mr. Montgomery's life for the past 2 years." Judge Patterson peered over her glasses. "Proceed." "The defense calls Jessica Vane." Arthur froze. He spun around in his chair. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Jessica walked in, flanked by 2 marshals. She wouldn't look at Arthur. She took the stand. She was sworn in. Archibald approached her. "Miss Vane, you were Mr. Montgomery's romantic partner and business associate, correct?" "Yes," Jessica said softly into the microphone. "Did Mr. Montgomery ever discuss his plans for his children, Leo and Sam, with you?" "Yes," she replied. And what were those plans? Jessica took a deep breath. He told me that once the divorce was final, he planned to send them to a boarding school in Switzerland. He said he didn't want them cluttering up our new life. He called them baggage from a bad investment. The courtroom erupted. Judge Patterson banged her gavel. Order! Order! Cecilia, sitting next to her father, didn't move. She stared straight at Arthur. This was the killing blow. She knew Arthur loved his image as a father more than the reality of it, but saying it out loud destroyed him in the eyes of the court. He also, Jessica continued, her voice gaining strength, kept a safe in our shared apartment. He told me that if anything ever happened, I should burn the contents. He said it contained leverage. Did you burn it? Archibald asked. No, Jessica said. I brought it with me. She lifted a heavy black hard drive and placed it on the witness stand. It contains recordings, Jessica said, of Arthur bribing a city councilman to approve his building permits, and recordings of him planning to plant drugs in Cecilia's car to ensure he got custody. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a grave. Arthur slowly put his head in his hands. Benedict Sterling began quietly packing his briefcase, physically distancing himself from his client. Archibald turned to the judge. Your Honor, we move for immediate dismissal of the father's custody claims, and we submit this hard drive to the district attorney for immediate review regarding criminal conspiracy charges. Judge Patterson looked at Arthur with an expression of pure disgust. Motion granted, she said, the gavel coming down like a gunshot. Mr. Montgomery, you are to surrender your passport immediately. Marshals, take custody of the evidence. Arthur looked up. He looked at Jessica, who looked away. He looked at Benedict, who was studying his shoes. Finally, he looked at Cecilia. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She looked at him with a profound, terrifying pity. She mouthed 2 words to him across the courtroom. Game over. As the bailiffs moved toward him, not to escort him out, but to detain him pending the criminal charges, Arthur realized the truth. He hadn't been fighting a divorce. He had been fighting a force of nature, and he had lost everything. 6 months later. The journey to the Otis Bantam Correctional Center on Rikers Island was a descent into a grey, metallic underworld, a stark and brutal contrast to the gilded cages of Manhattan, where Arthur Montgomery had spent his entire adult life. The visiting room was a place where hope went to die. It smelled aggressively of industrial bleach, stale floor wax, and the sharp, sour tang of nervous sweat. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, headache-inducing buzz, flickering intermittently, as if they too were exhausted by the misery they illuminated. Arthur Montgomery sat on a bolted-down steel stool behind the thick, scratched plexiglass partition. He had been the king of Wall Street, a man who wore $5,000 suits as armor and wielded his checkbook like a weapon. Now, he was inmate 84902. The bespoke Italian wool had been replaced by a drab, ill-fitting grey jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. He had lost at least 20 pounds. His collarbones were visible beneath the fabric, and his face was gaunt, the skin waxy and pale from lack of sunlight. His hair, once thick and perfectly coiffed with expensive product, was now thinning, grey at the temples, and shorn into a rough, institutional cut. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a ghost haunting his own life. He stared at the clock on the wall, his leg bouncing nervously. When the heavy steel door on the visitor's side buzzed and clicked open, his breath hitched. Cecilia walked in. The contrast was so sharp it almost hurt to look at. She looked radiant, glowing with a vitality that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the dreary room. She was wearing a coat of pristine white cashmere that looked soft enough to melt, paired with a silk scarf that likely cost more than the bail of half the men in this facility. She moved with a fluid, predatory grace, sliding into the seat opposite him without a hint of hesitation or discomfort. She didn't look like a wife visiting a husband. She looked like a CEO auditing a failed subsidiary. Arthur picked up the black plastic phone receiver, his hand trembling slightly. On the other side of the glass, Cecilia did the same, her movements calm and deliberate. "You came," Arthur said, his voice raspy and unused. I honestly didn't think you would." "I had to bring the final papers for you to sign personally, Arthur," Cecilia replied. Her voice was crystal clear through the receiver, devoid of the warmth he used to take for granted. She opened her leather briefcase, a sleek, hard shell piece that screamed authority, and slid a thick document into the metal drawer that passed between the divided worlds. "Your public defenders called my office this morning," she continued, her tone conversational. "They said you were refusing to sign the final surrender of the company assets. They said you were being difficult." Arthur looked down at the document in the drawer. It was the death certificate of his legacy. He let out a laugh, but it was a bitter, broken sound that scraped his throat. "The company? What company, Cece? It's gone. It's a carcass. The stock is trading at pennies. The brand is toxic radioactive waste. The SEC has picked the bones clean. Why do you even want it? Just to humiliate me one last time?" Cecilia watched him, her grey eyes unreadable. A small, mysterious smile played on her lips, the kind of smile the Sphinx might wear before devouring a traveller. "You're thinking too small, Arthur. That was always your problem. You only saw the facade," she said softly. "I don't want the brand, Montgomery Holdings. That name is dead. I want the infrastructure, the proprietary trading algorithms, the server farms in New Jersey, the long-term real estate leases on Park Avenue that you secured back in 2015. You see, I'm not just liquidating, I'm rebranding." Arthur squinted at her, confusion warring with his misery. "Rebranding? To what?" "I'm launching a new firm next month," she said, leaning in closer to the glass, her eyes locking onto his. "It's called Phoenix Capital, and my father and I have decided to pivot the business model. We're going to focus on a very specific, very lucrative niche market." "Which is?" Arthur asked, dread pooling in his stomach. "Forensic accounting and asset recovery for high-net-worth divorce litigation," she said, savouring the words. "We're going to help spouses find the money their partners are hiding in shell companies and offshore accounts. We're going to use your servers, your software, and your tricks to hunt men exactly like you." She paused, letting the irony sink in. "You inspired me, Arthur. You taught me exactly where to look. Who better to catch a thief than the woman who lived with the master of thieves for a decade?" Arthur stared at her, his mouth falling open. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. She wasn't just defeating him. She was cannibalizing his life's work to destroy men who shared his mindset. It was a poetic, vicious justice. You're cruel," Arthur whispered, tears pricking his eyes. "I have nothing left. I'm facing 5 to 10 years for fraud and embezzlement. Jessica is testifying against me next week to save her own skin. I'll be an old man when I get out of here. Isn't that enough? Do you have to mock me too?" Cecilia's expression didn't soften. She looked at him with the same clinical detachment a surgeon might use when looking at a tumor they had just excised. "You told me I was powerless," she reminded him, her voice dropping an octave, becoming hard as diamond. "Do you remember, Arthur, in the living room? You told me I was a nobody from nowhere. You said I was a mouse in a room full of cats. I just wanted to prove you right. Cecilia Montgomery was a nobody. She was a fiction, a role I played because I thought you wanted a partner, not a rival. She stood up, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles in her cashmere coat. That woman doesn't exist anymore. She died the day you served her those papers and laughed in her face. She looked down at him, her silhouette framing the harsh prison lights. I'm Catherine Harrington. I'm the head of the Harrington dynasty, and I have a board meeting to get to. She turned to leave. Wait! Cece, Catherine, please! Arthur panicked, pressing his palm flat against the smudged glass, the sound of his desperation echoing in the small room. What about the boys? What about Leo and Sam? Do they ask about me? Please, just tell me. Do they miss me? Cecilia paused. She stood with her back to him for a long moment, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. Slowly, she turned her head, looking back over her shoulder. They ask, she admitted, and I told them the truth. I didn't lie to them like you did. I told them that their father made some very bad choices, that he hurt a lot of people, and that he is in a time out so he can learn to be a better person. Arthur slumped against the glass, a sob escaping his lips. But don't worry, Arthur, she added, a final twist of the knife. My father is spending a lot of time with them. He's teaching them how to play chess. He says Sam has the Harrington instinct for the end game. He says they're going to be wolves, not sheep. She hung up the phone. Arthur watched her walk away, her heels clicking rhythmically on the concrete floor, a sound of freedom and power. He watched the heavy steel door slide open and then slam shut behind her with a final, echoing clang that sounded like the lid of a coffin closing. He sat alone in the grey room, trapped in the wreckage of his own arrogance, realizing too late that the most dangerous thing in the room hadn't been the man who shouted, but the woman who had listened. Epilogue. The view from the corner office of Harrington and Associates in Boston was spectacular. From the 45th floor, the harbour glittered under the winter sun like a sheet of hammered silver. The office itself smelled of mahogany, old books, and victory. Archibald Harrington sat in his tufted leather chair, his cane resting against the desk. He watched his daughter with a swelling sense of pride as she signed the final acquisition documents. The brass nameplate on her desk had already been changed. It no longer read Junior Partner. It read Catherine Harrington, Managing Partner. You did good, kid, Archibald said, his gravelly voice warm. He poured 2 fingers of a rare amber liquid, a 30-year-old single malt, into heavy crystal glasses. Better than good. You dismantled him. It was a masterclass. I had a good teacher, Catherine replied, capping her gold fountain pen and closings to the file. She looked at the signature. Catherine Harrington. It felt right. It felt like home. He called today, by the way, Archibald mentioned casually, handing her a glass. Benedict Sterling. Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly. And? Is he still blustering? Hardly. Archibald chuckled, a deep, satisfied sound that rumbled in his chest. He's begging. He's on his knees, Catherine. He's offering to surrender his law license, voluntarily if we agree to drop the civil malpractice suit. He says a trial would destroy what's left of his reputation. He's asking for mercy. Catherine took the glass. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city that was now her playground. She thought about the conference room where Benedict had sneered at her. She thought about the unfit mother threats. She thought about the way they had laughed. She took a sip of the scotch, feeling the burn. Take his license, she said, her voice cool, final, and absolute. And take his firm. We need a New York branch for Phoenix Capital. His office on Fifth Avenue will do nicely." Archibald raised his glass to her, a wicked twinkle in his eye. "Ruthless. I love it." "It's not ruthlessness, Dad," Catherine said, turning back to face him with a smile that was equal parts beauty and danger. "It's just business." They clinked glasses, the crystal ringing out like a bell. The war was over. The trophy wife was a memory. The Queen had taken the board, and the King had fallen. And that is the story of how Cecilia Montgomery, or rather, Catherine Harrington, turned a divorce settlement into a total conquest. It serves as a brutal reminder to everyone. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes, silence is just someone carefully gathering their ammunition while you're too busy talking to notice. Arthur Montgomery thought he was discarding a useless pawn, but he ended up crowning a queen who checkmated his entire life. What do you think? Did Arthur deserve that level of total destruction? Or did Catherine go too far by taking his company and his legacy? I'd love to hear your take. I read every single comment, so let me know down below. If you enjoyed this story of high-stakes revenge, hidden identities, and sweet justice, please destroy that like button just like Cecilia destroyed Arthur's ego. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. We have an even crazier, true-ish story coming next week about a lottery winner who faked his own death for 3 years to escape his in-laws. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.